Deep Rock Galactic is a sci-fi first-person shooter video game in which you play as a stereotypical fantasy dwarf working for the eponymously named space mining company DRG. The game presents a world with much suggested depth, but very little on the surface, as it is more concerned with delivering a satisfying gameplay loop of killing alien bugs while joyfully simulating the working life of a space dwarf. But it's that lack of narrative and of obvious thematic elements that I find most thought-provoking. When we dig beneath the surface, there are some very real and quite tragic messages sent by this game that all tie into the idea of industrial corporations being corrupt and audacious in their endeavours. Tragic only because, aside from the obvious science fiction elements, DRG as a company doesn't seem all that unbelievable in how it carries out its work and how it treats its employees. There is no explicit exposition really on any aspect of the game, and that is because the narrative of Deep Rock Galactic lies behind closed doors. The world building, the implementation of lore, and the inkling of a story are experienced as a side effect of a game that places a massive emphasis on gameplay and very little else. But I think that it's this very singular focus that makes these little tidbits of information about the game, through DRG as a company, stand out. In titling this chapter Delusion, I am really referring to the delusion that the dwarves as our player characters are under, in that they are working for a good cause. You're sent plummeting beneath the surface of the mineral-rich planet Hypocrisy 4 in order to extract all manner of resources and conduct extermination operations to reduce the population of hostile wildlife so that operations can run smoothly. It is constantly hammered into the dwarves that they are there to forge a better tomorrow. Propaganda is plastered across the space rig, and they are handsomely rewarded for their efforts. While there is also the implication that the dwarves are more than content digging and killing for money, and the corruption of the company is little concern of theirs. That corruption, however, is still very real.
Could I get a round of smart stout? Yeah!
Hang on, I'm starting to think Deep Rock is exploiting us common working. If we joined forces and founded our own mining company instead, we'd be raking in the dough. But we could just have another round of beer.
The mask begins to peel off when we look to specific examples that reflect DRG's hypocrisy. The biome known as the hollow bough arguably does the opposite, however. Here, you still encounter the generally expected hordes of glyphs and bacteria, but there was something amiss. The hollow bough is essentially a giant tree, a planetary region the core of which is entirely composed of petrified wood, and is under attack by an invasive species of red vines. The company points to this fact, I think, as a means to downplay accusations that their operations pose an unnecessary threat to Hypocrysy's native life, as the planet is already basically attacking itself. There was recently introduced to the game the narrative component of the unnamed rival corporation, which well and truly exemplifies DRG's audacity and self-contradictory behaviour. The company has a misplaced sense that Hypocrisy belongs to them, and to a certain extent so do the dwarves, but the reality is that they are undeniably trespassers on its alien world, or should I say that we are the aliens, to those that reside below the planet's surface. When the first multinational mining company came into the region, numerous short-lived profiteering schemes were concocted for the locals in order to serve the big company's own interests as they set about pillaging the treasure trove. This is from Carpentaria by Alexis Wright, and here Wright provides what could essentially be a DRG company briefing, or at least the ideal labelling that they would give to this rival company, when the truth is that this quote perfectly describes DRG itself. Only exception being that we would have to replace the locals in the passage with the dwarves, who are actually third-party contractors hired to do Deep Rock's manual labour. The truth is that this rival corporation doesn't really fit the bill of what Wright outlines at all, as their efforts are far more subdued. The rival corporation have thus far shown no interaction with any of the wildlife. Their only observed activities are the collection of data from dirt samples, and while it is hard to believe that their intentions aren't sinister, the only aggression they exhibited is towards the dwarves actively trying to disrupt their operations. And so it is also a further proponent of DRG's propaganda schemes that they attempt to drive home this ownership of the planet for them and the dwarves, and actively encourage the destruction of rival assets, when the only reason they can provide for this is that Hypocrysy's is our territory, a claim which is given credence only by a rather immature first come first served mentality. There's also something to be said about the greed of the dwarves even, by the rivals. Like I said, they don't interact with any of the wildlife at all, and the enemy creatures that are usually hostile to the dwarves show no interest in rivals whatsoever, and that just can't be a coincidence. Even the loot bugs, which are passive creatures that feed on valuable resources, go untouched by the rivals, while most players can't resist the urge to bash their brains in, not before giving the poor little bastard a pat on the head. And that's just cruel. Wait a minute. So now it's clear to see the corruption, greed, and cruelty that Deep Rock Galactic carries with it in its endeavours, both in terms of its operations and methods of indoctrination. They claim this planet simply because of its vast deposits of valuable resources without any concern for the local wildlife, species of which they actively hunt and kill in order to keep their operations running. And this hostile wildlife that they try to sell as the enemy show absolutely zero aggression towards the passive wildlife, some examples of which DRG encourage the Doors to kill simply because they like to snack on minerals. DRG also tarnishes the environment with hulking machines that are simply left behind to poison the environment once they've served them, destroying habitats and potentially damaging ecosystems. It's essentially made the purpose of Deep Rock's employees to genocide the Mactera and Glyphic populations. And why? Just to make a quick buck? I think that as a game, Deep Rock Galactic possesses some worrying parallels to corporations of the modern day, in who we observe boundless consumption and exploitation of natural resources, and I do think that in some capacity the game really is trying to reflect the passing off done by these companies to help maintain their image, and part of the goal of the game is that you have to see through this facade, although I'm sure they wouldn't want you to stop playing as a result. Special thanks to Gosha for making this possible, and to Sophus for composing such an incredible soundtrack, examples of which were heard in this video.